Welcome to Genesis. Biodiversity, food security, human economic development, so many different issues, dilemmas and so on. But to cast a very different perspective, I think, we have two international experts and we have our very own resident expert, Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda. And now joining us today, we have Professor Chris Johnson and Dr. Andrew Balmford, both of whom have taken time off their holidays to share their expertise with us. Welcome to Genesis and thank you for agreeing to join us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Andrew, I have a question. You have brought an optimistic perspective on a topic which is usually clouded by pessimism, obscured probably by pessimism. Can you tell us more?
So I'm a conservation scientist, and the thing that motivates me is what's happening to the planet's biodiversity and what we can do about it. And I take a view that we can do something, and people are doing things, and that's remarkable. And that we're not going to solve the entire problem. We are losing species, but we have a choice, and we can lose a lot more. In a similar way, we can see terrible degrees of climate change if we take our eye off the problem. But it doesn't have to be like that. There are things that people do that are already doing all around the world that work, and that studying those successes is a powerful thing because it helps us learn what works, and so we can scale up from those examples. It helps us to defend the successes that we've got and learn where we need to improve things. And it's also critically important for inspiring the general public and for all sectors of society. I take the view that no one's going to sign up to something if you tell them this is a disaster, this is terrible, and you don't provide them with an answer. I think that's a part of the story, and I think the conservation movement does quite a good job at conveying that this is a crisis and a real crisis. But I think we need to be much more positive about it, based on good evidence that shows that this is what we can do. This is not an impossible challenge. There are ways out
Andrew,
of this.
in the context of developing countries, which don't have the kind of money to invest in huge conservation interventions, is it still affordable? Are there success stories that can be applied to countries like Sri Lanka?
Absolutely, all around the world. And I see conservation successes, they're not exclusively or even a predominantly rich country phenomenon, they're around the world, and they involve all sorts of different sectors with different motivations, different problems, different ways around the solution. And sometimes it doesn't involve money at all. One of my favorite examples comes from a mountainside in Ecuador, extreme west of Ecuador, west of the Andes, an exceptionally important place for biodiversity, but heavily cleared, very few forests left, one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. And for decades, conservationists from the north had gone down and said to Ecuadorians, you must do something about this. This is really important for the world. And these people had relatively limited choices. Outsiders were coming in and cutting down their forests, using it for other uses, and nothing really happened. And then one day, a biologist was there. She was catching birds in the forest and to look at this extraordinary diversity, taking them out into the clearings to process them, as you do when you caught a bird, before releasing them. And she said, hang on a minute, why am I taking them out of the forest? This is the dry season, I'm taking them out of the forest, because the forest is wet. And she was working with the community, and she said, the forest is wet. And together they then worked out how wet, and worked out through simple science that the village's well-being was entirely dependent on retaining the forest, which kept the streams flowing during the dry season. And within a couple of months of the local people discovering that for themselves, the forest, they undertook to safeguard the forest, and it's not been touched since. So that was local people, no money, just seeing the problem from their perspective rather than taking a northern perspective on it, and it worked.
And it's possible to measure this success at global scale. There was a study a few years ago that tried to understand how many species of mammals and birds would have gone extinct since 1990, but for conservation action. I think there have been 10 birds and 5 mammals have gone extinct in that time, but 3 times that number, 3 or 4 times that number, would have gone extinct, but they've been saved by interventions all over the world. So we really are slowing the curve of biodiversity loss by a large fraction. And the ingredient for that really is not knowledge and understanding or willingness, it's investment. You know, we just need to spend more on saving species and we can save a great deal more.
Gentlemen, how much of this knowledge is new in the sense that, to my mind, in 2005, Lord Stern's report captured much of what we as businesses should be doing, but a lot of the things that the optimism that you talk of and the community involvement that you talk of community involvement certainly seems obvious and necessary, but how much of these techniques that you're talking about, how much of it is new and how much is ancient knowledge?
I think conservation science as a discipline matured, well, in my view, matured 20 or 30 years ago. We sort of worked out the basic principles and the basic methods for protecting biodiversity and saving species. And since then, we've added some sort of technical capacity, things like environmental DNA for monitoring and modelling of big data. But the real challenge has just been implementation and the integration of ecological and social science to generate change at the community level. So I think that's where we're at now. The knowledge mostly is there. We know how to protect biodiversity and save species. The gap is in investment and sort of general community understanding.
Rohan, a couple of weeks ago you launched a beautiful book that you had edited on discovering species in Sri Lanka. How much about nature, what do you think, to what extent do we understand nature and how much remains to be discovered in your opinion?
Well, the people who are doing the discovering feel that there's a lot more yet to be found. And we haven't, by any yardstick, even exhausted the search for new vertebrate species in Sri Lanka, let alone flowering plants. So it wouldn't be surprising if we were to find another 100 or so species of flowering plants in Sri Lanka, which are presently unknown. In addition to new species of amphibians, for example, this is very likely to happen in the coming few years. So exploration is one side of it, but as we get the data, what we do about conservation is one thing. And I have another question for you, Chris, because when we look at the past of Sri Lanka, we're looking at the threats to biodiversity that we all are familiar with: overexploitation, alien species, habitat change, and so on. And the looming threat that we're all concerned about is climate change. Now, at the same time, Sri Lanka has had large mammal extinctions. We don't know when, but we know from remains in cave middens and so on that we've lost a couple of species of rhinoceros, a hippopotamus, a tiger, a lion, the gaur. We've lost them in the relatively recent past. And we assume that these were lost because of climate change. Now, you had a similar experience in Australia where you lost a megafauna.
Yes.
I think you worked on this, right? What did you find there? What were the drivers of those extinctions in Australia? Was it climate change? Was it people? Was it something else?
I think the evidence is that it was almost entirely human arrival and human impact. Not everyone is convinced by that, mainly because it's very, very hard to produce the archaeological evidence that shows that people were hunting those big animals at the rates necessary to cause extinction. But we're now talking about archaeology that's 50,000 years old, and there's just not much there, a few stone tools in most cases. So it's very difficult to reconstruct human behaviour, but the coincidence of human arrival with extinction is really clear. In Australia is useful as a case study of this because this all happened in the middle of the last glacial cycle when the climate was actually quite benign. It was a bit dry, but also it was cool, so evaporation was low and there was good plant cover and there was plenty of water. And there's no reason to think that a climate event at that time caused those extinctions. New Zealand, next door to us, had a megafauna extinction, but that happened just after 1280 AD, when Maori people arrived. So that coincidence of human arrival and megafaunal extinction, independent of climate, is global, I would say. And I strongly suspect that it's the same story in Sri Lanka, without the archaeology to prove it.
But still, we invoke climate as being a major threat. And in our case, we have, for example, 120 species of amphibians in this country. The preponderant majority are endemic, and a lot of them are really sensitive. They're narrow-range endemics restricted to very small areas. Now, as warming happens, because our habitat is fragmented, one of the big challenges, for example, Dilmah has been working on, is trying to build corridors between these remaining forest fragments. Does that kind of intervention work?
Yes, it should. I mean, there are some problems that are very difficult to solve, like high elevation endemics in cloud forest, where the cloud layer is lifting because of climate change. And I'm sure that's a problem in Sri Lanka. It's a problem in the wet tropics of Australia, where some endemic possums are now declining very, very fast. And that is the kind of problem where we might need ex situ conservation, in the hope that eventually we can solve the climate problem and stabilise climate and find refuges for those species. But that strikes me as being an extremely difficult problem, and one of the causes of pessimism.
Yes. Yeah.
You spent long time studying the Holy Grail, how to reconcile biodiversity conservation with food security and human development. What would you consider as an example? I know there's many, but one notable example of how you could achieve that balance, Andrew?
So we work on various aspects of that. So we do some stuff on the demand side. How can we limit the growth of human demand for food through reducing waste, through dietary interventions? But the primary focus of our work has been on the supply side, asking the question, how can we produce food more efficiently in terms of the land it occupies, and as a result spare land within a country to retain or restore as natural habitat. One of the best examples of that happening at scale, and another example of a good news story that actually the rest of the world doesn't hear very much about, has been in Brazil, in the Amazon forests, during the previous administration of the current President Lula, and indeed now. And those two phases have seen dramatic decreases, which we don't hear about in Amazon deforestation. So both times now, the deforestation's gone down by half. During the previous longer-term presidency, it went down by about 70%. We didn't hear about that because the media like to report bad news, not good news. And that was through a complicated but really interesting combination of sticks and carrots. So there were restrictions on landowners in terms of not clearing land, clearing forest to make new space, but at the same time incentives in the way of credit. So if you were a rancher in Brazil, one of the main reasons why you can't increase the yields you get is a lack of credit, lack of ability to invest in better pasture for cows, better veterinary care, and so on. And during this regime, you couldn't access credit, not if you deforested, but even your neighbours. So if you're in a municipality that deforested, you couldn't get credit for your operation. So you were encouraged to work with all of your neighbours to slow deforestation. Then you could get credit, and then you could invest in making the best use of the land you'd already got and not need to clear more land. So to me, that's a really good example. Brazil's productivity during this period went up and up, but the rate of deforestation slowed a lot by making agriculture more efficient. So I think that's quite exciting. There are lots of examples of that kind of thing happening, but that's one where we understand the causality, and it really happened at very large scale.
But Andrew, you've, if I've understood you correctly, have not been an advocate of mixed agroforestry kind of approaches. Why is that? Because this is something that seems to be received wisdom in this country, for example.
Yeah, so I don't have a view in particular about any particular system saying this is good or this is bad. What I'm interested in are the outcomes. and in particular, as I've just been saying, in terms of resolving the food crisis, the food biodiversity trade-off, it's all about producing what we need on less land. And the reason for that is because when we've gone out and we've worked now in 10 countries around the world with long-term projects, and we look at individual species, thousands of them, look at how they respond to different farming regimes, what we find is that in every place we've ever looked, the majority of species never live on a farm. They can't exist. Once we start farming land, once we put in a few cows, or we put in even understory coffee, those species go. And what that means is that for those species, not the others, but for those species, which are often the ones which are most narrowly distributed, for which that place is particularly important, we're going to lose them unless we can safeguard those natural habitats. So agroforestry systems that we've looked at, silvopasture systems in ranching and so on, they very often can't support those species. And so what we've ended up concluding is that if nature had a vote, if all those species could ask us, how would you like, tell us how they would like us to produce our food, the majority of them would say, produce food efficiently on land you have cleared, and leave the rest of it for us. And that seems to be a universal. Now, how you achieve that high yield, I'm agnostic. I don't have a view, and sometimes it will be through agroforestry or silvopasture, but sometimes it will be through very efficient, not terribly different to current day practices. I'm open-minded about that, provided it's environmentally and socially sustainable.
So the core message is don't deforest new land.
Exactly, and in countries like mine, the UK, where we've lost nearly all of our forest, well, pretty much all of it, make space for reforestation, but do so by making better use of the land we've already cleared, not by reducing production and simply offshoring then our demand to other countries where they deforest as a result.
Chris, you've done a lot of work on predators, large herbivores, and so on. Are there any examples of how we balance their conservation and the economic demands, food production, and so on?
Yes, and I think the place where I can see that happening most successfully is, again, parts of Europe and related to the rewilding philosophy. One of the conservation success stories that we should celebrate is the return of large carnivores to Western Europe, and also ecologically important species like beavers and large herbivores. And that requires community willingness to accept those animals back, but also ways of reconciling conflict between wolves and bears and sheep farmers and other livestock producers. And there are successful methods for doing that. And one that excites me at the moment is the use of livestock protection dogs, guardian dogs, which have been re-established in pastoral communities, in farming communities in Europe, with the support of both governments and non-government conservation agencies, as a way of bringing wild nature back to human-modified landscapes. And also to take advantage of some of the opportunities that are provided by land abandonment in Europe, which is also partly driven by high-yield farming in other places. Rewilding needs space to rewild in, and to some extent that space is coming back into availability.
There's a lot of talk of bringing back species. Of course, that's a different branch of science, but are there species from the past that you would say are irrelevant, are no longer have a role or relevance in today's environment?
Well, I'm sure most of them do, and especially if we consider megafaunal extinctions, it would be terrific to bring back woolly mammoths and let them go in Siberia, thylacines in Australia, the dodo, all of that. The problem I have with that is the feasibility of doing it. It's no longer considered feasible to clone those species, even when you've got a genome of a woolly mammoth. What the people who are aiming for de-extinction now are trying to do is create chimeras. Essentially, a chimera is a species that's a bit of one thing and a bit of another, like an Asian elephant with some mammoth genes sort of knitted into its genome that's meant to look like a woolly mammoth.
If we look at conservation in countries like Sri Lanka, most of the effort that comes from government and from legislation is aimed at protection. Don't cut trees, respect protected areas, and so on. The science that designs the interventions that you need to recover species and so on doesn't come from government. It comes from individual scientists, from civil society, if you will. But a challenge that we have is integrating those civil actors into the national conservation framework so that government and civil society can work together to provide conservation outcomes, successes. This hasn't worked in our country. Do you know of any examples where it has worked, where we could maybe learn from?
That's a very good question. I think generally it hasn't worked, or generally it's difficult, and I can understand why. Policy moves relatively slowly, and once it's set a course, it finds it difficult to change course. And once it's set a narrative to the public, it's difficult to change that. Science can be nimble, that's the whole point.
Well, how do you, as a university academic, both of you in fact, how do you feed your scientific results into policy frameworks?
I think, and that's the challenge, and I think it's really difficult. So we spend a lot of time in Cambridge working with practitioners, both in government and in NGOs, and we have varying success. So I think in the UK, I think my work and work of my colleagues influenced UK government policy very little. Actually, I think there is an existing sort of set of received wisdom, and that's the way we're going. And science isn't going to change that very much. Whereas other countries where we work, and my group and some of my colleagues work in many other countries, it's more nimble and more attuned, more interested in responding to science. I think that's a good thing. Others wouldn't. So I've had more influence, I think, on government policy, ironically, in countries like China or Brazil, which are not my country, but because I can get to speak, and my colleagues in those countries can get to speak to people quite high up in government, and government is prepared to change course on the basis of scientific evidence, more so than in some European countries, I would argue.
I ask especially, there's an Australian example, I think, of a skink from Christmas Island, which went extinct. Despite the local conservation managers saying, we need to save the species, we need to do something. And this is a developed country, and this happened like 10 years ago, where the last skink disappeared because government wouldn't listen. How can this happen in a developed country like Australia?
It's very embarrassing and quite shameful. I think the problem in that case was that the bureaucratic and legislative processes were very, very slow. There was an awful lot of reporting and reassessment and monitoring. And another case is the Christmas Island pipistrelle, little bat, which is quite famous because we can pinpoint the exact date of extinction. It was being monitored by recording of its calls. And there's a time and a date for the very last call of the last pipistrelle, and it wasn't very long ago. But there have been many reports written and very beautiful data showing the trend of decline. So there was no doubt that there was a problem. But it takes about 12 months to do any kind of reassessment of the conservation status of a species, at least, under existing legislation. And until the legislation changes, that really can't be sped up. And I suspect it's the same elsewhere. The US legislation, threatened species legislation, is much better than ours. But once we're stuck with an act that's not working very well, it's actually difficult to change it.
Yeah, and not least because the Act has some, in the case of UK endangered species legislation, it's better than nothing. And there are people that would want to dismantle it completely. So if you start saying as scientists, actually I think this is a problem and we should delist this species, you risk an avalanche of, we'll throw the whole thing away then. So I fear in a European context there are some very powerful pressure groups that don't really want to change direction, both from the environmental side, but particularly from some of the industry sectors that don't want to change things very much. And they've had 50 or 100 years to build up very powerful mechanisms to slow change. So I think the kind of things that as scientists we have the luxury of changing our mind, and I think at policy level it's trickier in a way the more bureaucratic the country, and I think Europe and the UK are good examples of that.
I have a question relevant to Sri Lanka as well, if I may, relevant to Dilhan, which is we've been traditionally a tea growing country for a century and a half now, and the extent under tea is declining slowly because of demand for land and shortages of labor to work tea. People don't want to work with their hands any longer, and so on. This transition has happened in countries as they grow more prosperous. We've seen tea declining in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on. What's the best way of restoring those lands, or should we look at restoring or changing to other types of productive agriculture? That's
a good question. It's certainly a topic that's underway, that's at the centre of lots of discussions in a European context too. So it's happening. We know quite a lot about restoration. I mean, you will know much more about restoration here than I, and it's possible. Certain habitats are easier than others, so we know how to do some of those things. Tropical forests are trickier, wetlands generally easier, and so on. So we do know how to do some of those things. The one thing I'm concerned about there, and I don't know about it in a Sri Lankan context, but it's certainly in the context of Europe, is that we are producing less, and there is public support for producing less food within Europe and having a nicer looking countryside, but we're not eating any less. And so what's happening is we're shifting our footprint more and more overseas, and that's happening a lot in wealthier parts of the world. It's happening in Japan, it's happening in the UK, it's happening across Europe. And those other places that are then producing for us, they tend to be more biodiverse and to have less efficient farming systems on the average. And that means the biodiversity impact is not only not going away and it's moving somewhere else, it's bigger. So in a global sense, that problem of what the economists call leakage is a huge problem. And so in Europe, where we're trying to encourage restoration, I'm quite concerned that we only do so at the same time as maintaining production on the rest of our landscapes. So we don't simply offshore the problem elsewhere, where we can't see it, but the world feels it.
Chris, clearly there's collaboration needed across several disciplines. The problem is of a scale that demands that. But what's the role of communities? How important are they? And is it a priority that we engage communities?
Yes, absolutely. And again, one of the successful trends or encouraging trends in conservation worldwide, particularly in Australia, is the increasing importance of non-government organisations funded by philanthropy or donations or business, and Indigenous people who, when given the opportunity and freedom to manage their own land, do it very well, often because they have a much stronger set of values and connection to land than the settler society. And again, I'm thinking about Australia in this case. So the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, for example, now owns and manages for conservation about 7 million hectares in reserves that are spread all over the continent. All that government has to do is cede control and let people get on with it themselves. And that's the hard thing for government to do. Governments always want to be in charge and to tell people what to do. But sometimes the best thing they can do is get out of the way.
Rohan, Chris, Andrew, thank you. In the next part of this conversation, which will be a lecture by Andrew, we'll be exploring how to feed the world without costing the earth, a more topical subject or a more necessary, urgent subject I have rarely come across. So thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen.